Let's learn in this video how to monitor an AKS Azure Kubernetes Service cluster using Prometheus Grafana managed services on Azure. Let's first explore what are the monitoring options for an AKS cluster. We have actually mainly 4 options. First of all would be to install the entire stack inside the cluster itself using 2 open source tools like Grafana and Prometheus. A second option would be to use a stack provided by Azure Cloud. And a third option would be to choose a stack that is managed by a third-party cloud provider or a SaaS offering. And a fourth option that will combine both first and second option, that is using Azure Cloud with support for native OSS tools like Prometheus and Grafana. Let's detail those 4 options, and let's start with the first one, which is let's say the most native to Kubernetes, that is using monitoring using in-cluster deployment. So here we are talking about installing Grafana and Prometheus servers and components inside the cluster itself. So this option is great to have full control over the configuration. We know with Prometheus there are tons of configurations that we can apply. So if you own that Amphra, or if you own that tool in your cluster, then you will be able to apply this much of a configuration. But this might be bad for managing Prometheus cluster. Prometheus actually is not just one component, it's cluster, it's multiple components. So as you see in this screen right here, we have the Prometheus server, we have the database, we have the push gateway API, the alert manager, the Prometheus dashboards, tools to scrape the metrics, and so on. So lots of tools to be managed. So you need to worry about managing the disk and the data, the backups, the updates for that server, and because it's installed on your cluster, so it will consume some of your cluster resources. Typically, I have seen customers whom dedicating from 1 to 3 nodes specific to the Prometheus server to have a high availability, redundancy, and to make sure that it will always be working. And because here you will typically install 1 Prometheus server per cluster, so there are no central server. If you want to monitor all of your clusters using one single dashboard, one single control plane, then actually you can still do it, but it's up to you to do it manually, and it requires more work. So we said it's a little bit hard to manage Prometheus because it have lots of components. So the community have developed some tools that you can use today to make that management a little bit easier, like using the Prometheus operator or the Thanos operator. I have put links right here. And by the way, if you want to watch my video about how to about the Prometheus and the Grafana architecture and how to install it in your cluster, you can watch my video available and this link available on YouTube. Let's go now to the second option, which will be using the Azure managed services for your AKS. So in Azure, we have the Azure Container Insights, that is using Azure Monitor and Log Analytics in order to get not only the metrics from your cluster, but to get also the logs from that cluster, save it into Log Analytics, and then you will be able to create dashboards around that. This option is great for because data and servers are installed outside your cluster. Actually, inside your cluster, you will only install the monitoring agents, the Azure Monitoring Agent, AMA, that was previously known as OMS. And then those agents will collect the logs and metrics, and they will send it to Log Analytics. It's also good because it's using managed services, so all aspects related to data retention, backup, scalability will be managed by Azure for you. And it's one-click deployment. You just go to the Azure portal to your cluster, click a button to enable monitoring, and behind the scenes Azure will create the Log Analytics instance for you, will configure it, install the monitoring agents, and so on. And you get Azure support. With this option, you can have data aggregation for multiple clusters. So you can imagine scenarios where multiple clusters sending the data into the same log analytics instance, so that you can create queries that will go across those clusters. But this approach could be bad in some situations where there are actually less config options for customization. Don't get me wrong here, it's less compared to Prometheus, because with Prometheus, as we said, you own that service and you get access to all of the configuration options there. It will incur also additional cost for log analytics, and again here, you will always pay for using these tools, even if they are open source. So either you install it in your cluster, and in that case you will pay from your AKS resources, or you use a managed service on Azure like Log Analytics, and in this case you will pay for Log Analytics. So it's a trade-off to make between the two. Another thing to consider here is that there are no rich dashboards and alerts. Here actually you can create them, but it's up to you to create it manually for your scenario. So compared with Grafana dashboards, we have so much less dashboards available for the community. Let's now explore the option number 3, which is using managed services, not in Azure, but available with third-party providers. Those third-party providers could host their infra in Azure, like what Datadog does, or Logz.io, or Elastic, or Dynatrace, okay? But they could also have their own infra, like what Splunk and Grafana Cloud does today. So again, this is using almost the same architecture as with the option number 2 with the container insights. So only the monitoring agents will be installed inside your AKS cluster, and those agents will send data into a cluster agent, for example, or directly to the third-party provider that will ingest that data and will give you dashboards to view it. This approach is great because it's easy to install and configure. The provider will give you actually very simple scripts to run, and it will do all the plumbing for you. And it only and because it only the agents are installed inside the cluster, so it will not consume much of resources on your cluster. You get support from that provider because you will buy this license or this subscription, and then they will have actually a rich set of dashboards and alerts provided by default into your dashboards. Those tools typically give you more than monitoring. They will give you also logging and traceability features, so you will get all of the 3 available on one dashboard, so you can see both the monitoring, the metrics, the logs, and also the traceability for your applications and those dashboards. It could be bad because it will incur additional costs. Again, there are always a cost for using a solution, okay? And then it will have a vendor lock-in, because here you are just sending your data into a vendor that have some tools that are specific to him and that are not supported by other tools. I have put here an example of tools that have native integration with Azure, for example, like Datadog, Logz.io, Elastic, and Dynatrace, and some other tools that does not, at least yet, have integration with Azure, like Splunk, Grafana Cloud, and many more. Let's now go to explore the option number 4, which we'll focus on today, which is using Azure Monitoring with Native OSS open source software tools. Here we'll be using Container Insights integration with Prometheus metrics and Grafana. So this option actually would be great because it's easy to install and configure. You just click a button, and because it is using managed services, those services from Prometheus managed service in Azure and managed Grafana service, so the backup, the scalability, and the data retention will be managed automatically for you, and only the agents are installed inside the cluster, or the database will be outside your cluster managed by Azure. and it is using native Azure services, and you'll get also an Azure support for that architecture. It does have a rich set of dashboards and alerts because, again, this is using Grafana. It's the same Grafana with the open source tool, so it will benefit from that large community dashboards available for Grafana. You can go to install any available dashboard from there. But it could be bad for additional costs. Again, there are always a cost for running infrastructure, and it does have a vendor login, but here actually that vendor login is not that much important because here you still rely on open source tools even if they are hosted on Azure Cloud. But now let's go to take a look at that infrastructure or that architecture, how it will be running in our cluster. So what we see on the left here are the node exporters or the monitoring agents that will be using AMA, Azure Monitoring Agent, that is what was previously known as OMS. That will be installed as a daemon set in your AKS cluster. So in each node you would have a monitoring agent installed. All of those, they will expose metrics and send, push the logs and the metrics into the data platform on Azure, and you can go to use annotations to enable or disable some metrics or some pods or deployments from your cluster. So the metrics will be sent using the metrics add-on. They will be sent into the Prometheus managed instance, and you'll be able to query that data using PromQL language available with Prometheus, and you will be able to visualize the data using Grafana dashboards, and then using Prometheus alerts you will be able to set up some alerts using the Prometheus language. And for the logs, because those Azure Monitoring Agent actually collects both logs and metrics, the logs will be sent into log analytics, okay, and you'll be able to visualize it using workloads or using Azure dashboards, and then you'll be able to set up logs using alerts using log alerts. Great, I hope this was helpful for you. And the next here I'll go to show you a demo on how we can enable AKS monitoring through Grafana managed instance and through Prometheus on Azure. Let's learn in this video how to enable monitoring for an AKS cluster using Azure Monitor Workspace for Prometheus and using Grafana Managed Service. So as you see here from my AKS Kubernetes cluster, if I go to Insights, I will see those options available for me. So I'll need Log Analytics Workspace, Prometheus Metrics Workspace, and then the Grafana Workspace. I go to create those services first, and then I'll go back here to configure them. So let's go to my resource group where I have here the Kubernetes AKS cluster already created, and here I'll go to add two other resources that are the Prometheus workspace and the Grafana workspace. So I'll go to search here for Prometheus, managed Prometheus. And here it is. If I click on it, that will take me to the Azure Monitor. From here, I have a new option that is the Managed Prometheus. If I go to click Create a new instance, then that will take me to this page where I should mention my subscription name, the resource group. I go to choose the same resource group for my AKS cluster, then specify a name. Let's call it Prometheus Workspace, for example. Then I specify a region for that service, and then I go to Review and Create. When it's validated, I'll go to click Create. Great, so with that we have created the first service that will be added into the resource group right here. So now I have AKS and the Prometheus workspace. Now I'll go to add another resource that is the Managed Grafana service. So here, if I look for Grafana, I find Azure Managed Grafana. I go to create a new instance. I specify my Azure subscription, and then I'll go to specify resource group name. I'll continue with my AKS RG, and then here I'll specify a location, then the name of my managed instance. Let's call it Managed Grafana, for example, Managed Grafana for AKS. And then I have some other couple of options like using zone redundancy, some advanced options for using API key creation, deterministic outbound IPs, specifying some permissions. And note here, it will include myself as a Grafana administrator so that I'll be able to access using my Azure identity right here. Once I'm ready, I'll go to review and create. Once the validation passes, I'll go to click create button. Now, once the Grafana managed instance was created, I can go to take a look at the resource group that contains the resources, and from here I will see the managed Grafana instance and the Azure Monitor workspace. Note that here there are some other resources created in another resource group, that is this one here, where we see the data collection endpoint and data collection rule created for Prometheus instance. Let's go back to our resources right here. Let's go start looking first for the Prometheus instance. So here, if I go, I get here the overview, where here I have the query endpoint. If I want to run query QL languages, then from here I can use a prompt QL in order to query the metrics. And they have the metrics ingestion endpoint. This is what my monitoring agents will use in order to send the metrics into this Prometheus workspace. And then here we have two options for monitored clusters and linked Grafana workspaces. So for linked Grafana workspaces, for now I don't have anyone linked, but I can go click for link and then specify one of the Grafana instances that I have in my Azure subscription. I will do this later from the AKS cluster. And here I have also the monitored clusters. So here it will detect that I have an AKS cluster already created, and here I have the configure button that will go to do all the plumbing for me. Again, I'll do this from the AKS cluster itself. So let's go back to the resource group and let's see the options available within the managed Grafana instance. So here I see the endpoint where I can get access to the dashboards, and here I will have actually a few options for the identity. Here it's using the system assigned identity, and for the configuration it have those options that we have dismissed when during the creation. We can go back and configure them from here. Let's again go back to our cluster, to the insights section right here, and let's go back to configure. So if I click configure, and here comes the interesting part. So here I will need a log analytics workspace. So if I don't have any, a new one will be created. That's why I have a new between parentheses. I can enable to use managed identity with that workspace, and then I can choose to use Azure Monitor managed service for Prometheus. That is still in preview today, but should be GA soon. And then I can enable that feature, enabling Prometheus metrics. So those metrics will be retrieved and sent into an Azure Monitor workspace. We have already created a workspace, so I specify that a new one created, or I can also allow Azure to create a new one for me. And I want those metrics to be accessible through the Grafana dashboard. So for that, I can go here to specify a Grafana dashboard. So I specified the one that I have created earlier. And yeah, this is the magic behind this feature right here. So we would have here our AKS cluster sending metrics into Prometheus, sending Prometheus metrics into log analytics workspace for Prometheus, and they will be available through Grafana dashboards. Here, if I go to click configure, then Azure AKS will go to configure or to create that required configuration to make all of this works together. And this will take a few seconds. Let's give it a time. While this is still deploying, let's take a look to our cluster, to what have been changed right here. So if I go to Kubernetes resources, let's go to workloads, for example, and then I'll go to daemon sets. Here I will find that there are two new install, or three actually, for the AMA, Azure Monitor Agent logs, one for Linux and one for Windows, and one for the metrics node. So here, those are the agents. It's the daemon set, so it's one agent installed per each node in my cluster. Those are the agents that will collect the logs and metrics, and it will send it to the Azure Monitor. In addition to that, there are a configuration that have been created also. So we see here the AMA Azure Monitor Agent logs rs config, and this one here created in order to manage the configuration of the monitoring agent. So here we have cube.conf file that will configure how the agent should forward and should filter the data based on those annotations. Great. Now, if I go back to the deployment, we can see that the deployment finished successfully. So from here, I can go to my AKS cluster, or actually go to the Grafana AKS. And from here, I'll find here the link in order to access the dashboard for Grafana. Actually, I will have one issue, is that for now it requires a professional account, so I cannot use my live.com account right here. So what I have done is that simply I have gone to access control, and I have added another role using add role assignment, and I have looked for the Grafana admin role, and then I add myself as a user with that access role. So as you can see it here, for Grafana admin, I have these two users. So I log in using my professional account right here. So I log in using the FQDN or the URL available from here. Note how it's a unique URL actually. First time you access this dashboard, it will ask you to log in and to enable single sign-on and so on. And after that, you will be able to access the managed Grafana dashboard available as an Azure service that will get the metrics from your Kubernetes cluster. Let's now go to take a look at those metrics. So I'll go here to the dashboards where I have actually three groups of dashboards, General Azure Monitor and one other for Managed Prometheus. So I'll take a look for this one for Managed Prometheus. Let's take a look at the cluster resources. So for now, it's pulling data from that Prometheus instance from my AKS cluster, and here we can see some details and some data popping up from my Kubernetes, from my AKS cluster. Let's go to see some other dashboards. Let's check the workloads, for example. So here I'm inside the default namespace where I don't have any application yet. So let's try, for example, Cube system, where we have multiple pod systems installed in there, and there we can see a few details about that. So we can view right here the pods for the Azure Monitor application right here that is installed inside my cluster, that will get logs and that will get metrics mainly from my AKS.